difference between addictions, habits, and rituals. So as a mental health professional, I think of addictions as things that we do that are not necessarily serving us. Addictions can be habits. So if you have a habit of going directly to the refrigerator and drinking after work because work is just awful and you hate your life, that habit is also an addiction. So I think addictions, I see them in my space as necessarily not useful. Habits also same way, like habits can be useful or not useful. And I think of rituals as kind of something that you do intentionally that are actually better for you.
What does it mean to live a meaningful inner and outer life? And how do our personal finances fit in that? We tackle those questions and others in the School of Financial Freedom podcast. We talk about the role of money in our personal growth and spiritual liberation, the concrete math of budgeting and saving and investing, and how all this relates to the life you were meant to lead. Each episode is an interview with a former student of my online course, Financial Freedom 1, where they explain their favorite lesson and years later, what financial, behavioral, and spiritual impact it had on them. I'm Douglas Soy, founder of School of Financial Freedom, and your host. Glad you're here.
Hey, this is Lindsay Kandra, and you're listening to the School of Financial Freedom podcast.
Hey, everyone. I'm excited to introduce you to Lindsay today because we're going to be talking about a pretty core lesson in Financial Freedom 1, which is about stress and status and capitalism. And Lindsay's going to have a lot to tell you about it because she works in this area professionally. But the stress cycle and how capitalism triggers trauma through inequality is one of the core reasons we consume so much. And Lindsay's going to have a lot. She had a lot to say when she took the course. And I'm super excited for her to tell you what she thinks about it now. So welcome, Lindsay.
Thanks for having me, Doug.
Yeah, tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
So right now, I currently work as a licensed professional counselor in a private practice here in the metro area in Portland. But this is my second career. I was a lawyer for about 13 years, had a little bit of a health crisis in 2010, and had a moment where I looked in the mirror and I'm like, what are you doing with yourself? You're stressed out all the time. You're on this hamster wheel because, as you probably know, Douglas, lawyering is a hamster wheel. And I decided to get off. And that was a journey that took about 6 years when I had to decide what getting off was going to look like. And I eventually decided to go into mental health. So got my master's degree in 2018. And I've been working in various aspects of mental health since then, whether that's community mental health, crisis mental health. I worked for a startup for 2 years. I taught college for a year, and now I'm just settling into full-time private practice.
Amazing. So was your health crisis being a lawyer?
Well, my health crisis was actually having cancer, but I definitely think that stress exacerbated. I do believe that stress has something to do with our body's ability to fight off cancers and fight off the health of our immune system. So I don't think stress causes cancer, but I don't think it helps.
Yeah, and to be clear, we're sort of joking about it because we're both ex-lawyers. And not specifically cancer, but I think I was unhealthiest when I was a lawyer.
Absolutely.
Not only in terms of my physical health, but my emotional and mental health too, right? And a lot of it is doing something that you were not meant to do for, most of your waking hours is not good for you.
Yeah, and also the sense of incongruence with who I was as a person. So I've always been a bit of a baby socialist. It started in college, and I got into doing private practice right out of the gate, where it was all about let's make more money, spend more hours. My job as a business attorney, a transactional attorney, was to make people money. And I was good at it. And I just was really struggling with who I was as a person. And I felt like I had lost my personhood a little bit. And I was just a cog in this wheel of money making for things that I didn't understand and for people I never saw.
Did it cause you to consume more than you typically would have?
Oh, absolutely. Particularly with substances. I got an exercise, I think. I was a semi-professional, got up to being a semi-professional bike racer right up to the point where I got cancer. And I also was probably a little bit of a functioning alcoholic at the same time. And it was just, I needed to feel something. And I felt something when I was writing, and then it felt overwhelming. And so I was drinking a lot because I was lonely. I was drinking a lot because I was unhappy. And it just got to be this vicious cycle. And unfortunately, for some of us, the vicious cycle stops when something like cancer happens, and you have to be still and intentional about things. For me, it was about a year of just a complete foundational shakeup about who I was as a person.
Yeah, your story is so poignant, and it relates so much to the lesson. So let's talk about the lesson, and then what's in the lesson, and then we can talk about like how it relates to both your own personal life and what you see as a mental health professional.
Absolutely. So I'm going to go just from reading this back, taking the class back in 2019 and doing a little bit of a review last night. What really stuck out with me in the lesson is the concept of the stress cycle and how capitalism keeps us in a constant state of fight or flight. So fight or flight just being your sympathetic nervous system response. It's what we do in the face of stress. And sympathetic nervous system, yeah, fight or flight. And that looks different for different people. Like some of us become things like hypervigilance. Some of us check out, dissociate. There's all sorts of things that being in a constant state of fight or flight does. And your mention of hypervigilance really stuck out to me because I do a ton of work with complex trauma. So complex trauma being not an acute event, but things that happen over time. And with my clients that are particularly sufferers of or have experienced abuse as a child, hypervigilance is one of the things that we see across the board. It's this constant state of feeling like I have to be aware for threats. And I have to be like constantly mindful of what people are thinking about me, or I have to anticipate other people's needs. And when I was reading it back in 2019, I remember that sense of feeling hypervigilant, and felt really great to know what to name it, because I felt like I was very, very worried through that whole series about that whole series of my life at the end of lawyering about what people thought of me and that I wasn't doing enough. And I think that's one of the things that hypervigilance and capitalism creates in us, is that I'm not doing enough, I'm not buying enough, I'm not thin enough, I'm not successful enough. And so we're constantly looking outside of ourselves for benchmarks.
Yeah, in the lesson, one of the things they talk about is that we are hypervigilant because of inequality, that it is our perceived social economic status, not our actually absolute wealth, because, I mean, we're incredibly wealthy in modern life compared to any other society, but a perceived social economic status of like, oh, like there's someone better than me, or I'm not enough, or like I'm constantly feeling like I'm on the precipice of like falling down, like I can't make rent, or I'm in debt. That is the constant stressor that you're talking about, right? Like it's chronic. It's not like these specific, like high grade events. It's these things that we experience daily.
It's chronic, and it's also insidious. And it makes me think of something I talk to my clients a lot about when they're coming to me and they're talking about things like imposter syndrome or not feeling like they're enough, is that what this system of capitalism and hypervigilance has done to us is make it think it's our fault. Like if I go to therapy, if I change my own behaviors enough, this will stop. And I get to have some really fun conversations around the system has set up to make it for you to think that it's your fault, when it's really things like how we structure debt and how we have to accumulate debt for growth, and how we were fed messages all the time about, oh, you think you're not enough, buy this thing, do this experience, like have this surgery. And these things aren't our fault. These things are also ingrained in the systems around us. And those are really important conversations to have. And I think that that's one of the things that I loved about this particular lesson, was kind of stepping out from blaming it on the individual and kind of looking at the system that's perpetuating it.
It's interesting because one of the things the article that is in the lesson talks about is so much of it is who we surround ourselves by. Like, for example, like if you were in Appalachian mountains, poor and rural, you actually experience less of the socioeconomic stress than us in modern society because we see people much wealthier who look more conventional or conventionally good looking than us. And I'm just curious what you think about that. Is part of it is just our access to so much information and media?
Absolutely. In that question is something that I ask people in my practice a lot is who are you surrounding yourselves with? Who are your social supports? Because in a more urban society, what you're talking about is definitely the case. Like we see affluence, especially if you live in Portland. Like I live on the borders of Irvington. I see affluence all the time. And it can be really easy to say, I wish that was where I lived. Or I look at the people that I went to law school with who are now judges and partners. I wish that was who I was and where I was in my life. And I think when in modern life, urban life, we have to be intentional about picking those 5 to 10 people around us, which is a blessing because if we live in a populated area, there's a lot more people to choose from. And we can find our communities, whether that's through this course or whether that's just through the people you work with or just randomly. I found a lot of random people that have resonated with me. I think intentionality is a big part of it. And the barrier to that is you have to slow down to be intentional. And some of what capitalism and social media, it's sped up. Everything is sped up, and so there's no space for intentionality. And again, something I work with my clients all the time is these decisions that you think are automatic aren't necessarily automatic, but you have to be able to slow down and like peel back the onion. Like, am I making this decision about who I'm surrounding myself with, what media I'm surrounding myself with intentionally?
It's funny because one of the main reasons that we're in the stress cycle is that we believe that there's no option. Like resistance to the perpetrator is futile, right? So we don't feel like we have any option. But what you're saying is we have some agency in like who we choose to be around. As I say in the course, you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with.
Absolutely. And I think you can hold both concepts and then still be true. Like we are in a system that we can't just check out from. We're not going to go to the moon. We can't go to Mars and check out of this system. But depending on privilege and a lot of other things at work, most of us have some agency around these things, whether what we buy, who we spend time with, what kind of media we consume.
But you're right. It's because to quote another guest, it's really about consciousness. And the faster we go, the less conscious we are, right? We think that we have to make the choices everyone else around us is making, and that compliance is the default.
Oh, absolutely. And the whole system, if you think about social media algorithms and the pace of life, we're conditioned to think that I have to keep up. I have to keep up with the Joneses. And I think that there's space in most of us to have a moment where we can slow down and realize, I can't step out of this, but I can actually step off the hamster. But it requires sacrifices, right? So living a more conscious and intentional life, like you may end up stepping down from a job where you're making a ton of money, lawyering, to a job where you have more freedom and purpose, but you're not making much money, mental health.
Well, it's funny because your status identity also creates your consumptive identity, and like you feel like you fit in everywhere. Like I remember, we are both ex-lawyers. Like when I started my job as a lawyer, we had to wear suits, right? And so like as a young lawyer, like everyone's buying super expensive suits, and I would buy like used suits, like at the Salvation Army, and would just wear them, and people thought I was quirky, and I didn't fit in. And that need to fit into your status identity is part of the reason why we feel so much stress in our status, in our lack of status.
Absolutely. And then as a woman, you can add the layer of the patriarchy on top of that. I can think of specifically around things like wardrobes for lawyering. Our clothes are more expensive. There is a pressure for women not to wear the same thing every day. Like it is more constraining. So you can just add layers on top of this, like dressing for your status, and then you add other intersectional identities on top of that. It just becomes all of a sudden you're stuck with a closet of clothes that you never wanted, aren't part of your identity, and don't feel right to you.
Yeah, the lesson after this, I already did the interview for, and Jesse talks. He's black, and it's about the race, status, and consumption lesson. He talks about when you're black, you don't have a choice not to dress well professionally, right? Like if you're white, you can kind of dress kind of schlubby and like you're being quirky and fun, right? But if you're black, you cannot do that. And so there are extra demands placed upon you that actually affect your personal finances.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's part of, I remember it's part of when I decided not to lawyer anymore. One of the big rituals that felt so freeing to me was I gave all those clothes away. Like all the stuff that I had purchased to put myself out in the world as a professional woman. Like, I don't need any of this more. I don't need any of these trappings anymore. And I remember that feeling of lightness, of getting rid of these things that weren't ever me and they were never going to be me. Plus, I just didn't fit anymore.
Yeah, what you're pointing to is in the lesson I write about Tyler Durden in Fight Club. And the quote, "We buy things we don't need and can't afford to impress people we don't like."
Yes, absolutely.
Let's talk about addiction, because the response to being caught in this work spend cycle is addiction, like the hypervigilance. A lot of people go into addictive behaviors. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I practice a type of cognitive behavioral therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy. You can look it up, it's evidence based. But one of the key components of it is learning how to be with hard emotions or difficult experiences. And learning, a lot of us spend a lot of time avoiding those difficult experiences or trying to mitigate them. So, hypervigilance, say. And when we're not accepting or learning to be in a new relationship with those hard emotions, that stress, that anxiety, that trauma, humans are brilliant at coming up with all sorts of ways to avoid being with that stuff. Addiction is like the primary of them. Like some of it can be to exercise, some of it can be to eating or not eating, it can be alcohol or drugs, it can be consumption. But those addictive behaviors create a dopamine serotonin response that allows us to, like, feels good. Dopamine rushes feel good, serotonin feels good, but they also allow us to avoid that dread stomach that a lot of us are walking around with. So when I do my assessments with people, I'm often talking to them, hopefully non-judgmentally, about like, what's your relationship with substances? Because it's just similar to your relationship with money. We have relationships with substances. And it's a big part of what people are doing to avoid that dread of, I want to get off this cycle, but I don't know how, or I'm stuck someplace and I don't know how to get out of it, or I'm not being who I am. It's like and again, caffeine is part of it too, and all these other substances, but they're all part of the package of how do this thing that's in my stomach is too hard to deal with because I think that I'm never going to be able to deal with it, easier to drink.
Lindsay, I have a question here. Do you have a delineation between good addictions and bad addictions?
God, this is so funny because I just talked to a client about this yesterday. I look at the difference between addictions, habits, and rituals. So as a mental health professional, I think of addictions as things that we do that are not necessarily serving us. Addictions can be habits. So if you have a habit of going directly to the refrigerator and drinking after work because work is just awful and you hate your life, that habit is also an addiction. So I think addictions, I see them in my space as necessarily not useful. Habits also same way, like habits can be useful or not useful. And I think of rituals as kind of something that you do intentionally that are actually better for you.
Well, I think about it on a deeper spiritual level. I see a lot of people who, quite frankly, they're addicted to work or they're addicted to success. And maybe the addicted is not the right word, but quite frankly, they keep on succeeding and they keep on moving up. They keep on making more money. they keep on getting bigger homes, nicer vacations, but I don't know. Is it serving them? I literally, yeah, I'm just, I don't know if you have anything to comment there.
Well, I think that's the same neurobiological response. It's just not with work and like something like alcohol. Excuse me. Is that when we succeed or we get the raise or the hustle pays off, you get the dopamine fix. I've succeeded. And then for the moment, you have the serotonin, the feel good, because you're able to purchase the thing, or you've gotten the raise or the new office, or you can send your kids to private school or something like that. But the problem with doing that unintentionally and without examination is you just do it more and more. And the same thing is happening in your brain with something like fentanyl as it is with work addiction. They're just operating on different levels. One of them is socially acceptable, the other is not.
So, like, I have friends who exercise, they're extreme exercisers. And you were a competitive biker. I'm just curious the relationship between you and biking, and yeah, is this part of the addictive cycle, or is it actually something really healthy?
Fine line. It's like a knife's edge. I have definitely been in both places with it. So I definitely have been in a place where it was unhealthy because I was doing it to avoid hard emotions. I remember very specifically in my life, I had went through a pretty bad breakup and was using riding myself into exhaustion in order to avoid thinking about stuff. I've also used exercise during my triathlon career as a way of punishing my body for my body not being kind of traditional. So knife's edge, like, again, I had to have a health crisis to kind of fall off on the other side. But I never got really back into competitive biking after I was done with treatment. So I had a way of like, I don't actually enjoy this type of like exercise anymore. I don't enjoy suffering. Suffering did something for me before cancer. And now, like, these days, I'm like, I don't want to suffer anymore. But it's a knife's edge on where you are and whether you're able to, I think for some people, able to acknowledge what's driving the need for the intense exercise. Lots of athletes have perfectly healthy relationships with endurance work and endurance exercise. Endurance exercise is a great way of dealing with depression. It really helps people with substances or ADHD. Like, exercise is awesome for mental health. It's that place where all of a sudden what's driving it is not the joy of it. And it's more of you're seeking, like, the suffering means something to you that's maybe not healthy.
After going through all of that, what's your relationship with the bike now?
I still ride quite a bit. As I said, I haven't competed in years. And I went through a process earlier this year where I bought my first a pedal assist bike. My partner mountain bikes, he's a mountain goat, and we had been going through 2 years of just me being fairly angry and miserable on all of our rides. My body has changed a lot in the last couple of years. I went through menopause quite early because of the cancer. My body has changed. I'm not as fit or light as I used to be, and I was just mad about it. But I'd also dug my heels in and was like, I'll just get back into shape. I'll no longer want to kill Eric every time we're going to go ride. And then I realized, oh no, this is where I'm at, right, in this moment. And why am I punishing who I am at this moment? And it sucked all the enjoyment out of an activity that I love. And it involved letting go of the identity of who I was literally 15 years ago to be like, oh no, I'm just going to get this pedal assist bike and now I can go mountain bike with my partner and I don't want to murder someone the entire time I'm riding because I'm suffering. But it involved letting go of that identity of that person and letting go of the nostalgia of that person that I was 15 years ago. Very fit, also very miserable. And now I'm less fit, much happier. So I have to like kind of get outside myself every once in a while and just remember, like, I'm wanting to be back in a place that wasn't all good. Super fit, super light, super miserable.
It seems like, I mean, it's been a journey of acceptance of who you are, exactly where you are right now, as opposed to comparing yourself to, a ghost, basically.
That's a really good way of putting it, because that's what it is. It's a ghost, and giving up the ghost is one of the hardest things I think I've gone through. in the last 5 years is just giving up the ghost of being traditionally financially acceptable, like successful, like quit comparing myself to my friends who are judges and partners in law firms and chairs of departments at Berkeley, and just giving up that ghost and realizing I'm actually okay with where I am. And the same thing with my athletic self. Like that was 15 years ago. Like I am not doing myself a service by holding on to that. And I'm also just spending a lot of time. You spend a lot of time holding on to those things. And in those moments, I feel like I can let go of that. I feel like I have my life back a little bit. But it's a journey every single day to do that.
Yeah, it's funny. I wonder if some of your, former law school friends are actually jealous of where you've landed. I know for me, like, my law school friends, like they are partners at law firms and, they're judges. And quite frankly, I look at some of them and some of them look miserable and like, but they don't know it because they're on the treadmill. They're going so hard, so fast, and there's so much prestige and success available to them. It doesn't to them. It feels like success, but from the outside, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. And I also like had this realization that at a certain point, I never wanted to work that hard. I think that's why I was so glad to step off the private practice treadmill when I was a lawyer. It was like, yeah, I could do this, and I don't want to work that hard. And then it came like, then there was a time that I had to accept that doesn't actually mean I'm lazy. I'm just making an intentional decision not to work that hard and not to like work 90 hours in a week. Like, meh.
If you look at human history, I mean, I firmly believe that no one should be working 40 hours a week. And hopefully in the future, we're going to look at this as a human rights violation. Like no one in human history, up until recently, worked this hard for this long. I think what we're talking about is this internal sense of not enoughness, right? Partially because we're creating this competition, the status competition with everyone else around us. But everyone feels like they're constantly not enough and they don't have enough and more is better. And that addiction cycle, actually one of the interesting things I read is that the United States produces 4,000 calories per person a day. And so part of capitalism is that we have to sell as many calories of this 4,000 calories per person per day. And that's part of the reason of the obesity epidemic. We're surrounded by food all the time. And to me, that's a great metaphor for capitalism, right? We were surrounded by consumptive choices all the time. So we feel like if we don't consume as much as we can, we're depriving ourselves.
Oh, absolutely. I had a thought and then my menopausal brain totally glitched on it. Give me a sec. It'll come back to me. Oh, I remember. One of the questions you asked me in preparing for this interview today was about where my learning edges are, where my growth edges are. And it's really interesting that you bring up food because I think that's one of the places where I have been doing a ton of work and thinking about my engagement with this system that I have a lot of work to do is around intentional consumption of food and being mindful around food in a way that's not a disorder or detrimental to my mental health. I'm a kid of a farmer, and I spent the first 20 years of my life being around food production and knowing the labor that takes and living the labor that takes. But I'm still a consumer of processed food, and I'm still a consumer at times of not ethically produced food. However, we have what you identify as a glut of choice. It is easier for me to walk up to Safeway and do that than it is to actually intentionally engage with what I'm eating and how I'm eating. Definitely a growth and learning edge for me. And that's what that reminded me of.
Yeah. And a former student once also told me that for women living under a patriarchal society, spending money or controlling what they eat is the only form of control that they have. And so they go to extremes around, or they spend more or they control their consumption more than they need to because it's a form of self-agency.
Absolutely. And that's what we see in clients with disordered eating, in whatever form it is. It usually originates in a acute event or a series of chronic or traumatic events that have led to a lack of control and agency. If you think about being a teenage girl is all about kind of lack of agency. Your body is going bananas. Nothing you do is good enough. Girl on girl violence with teenagers is like huge. And you're totally right. Like one of the things that we do sort of have ultimate control over is what we put in our mouths. And for a lot of people, like when everything else is so out of control, I can control whether I eat or not. I can control what I eat. Overeating, I can get rid of eating. And it's across the board, with eating disorder clients, like it comes down to control and being able to control the world around them when everything else feels out of control.
And to temporarily feel good, right?
Absolutely. Neurobiology, dopamine, the serotonin, the same thing works when people restrict. There is a dopamine rush when you make it through another hour or another day without eating. There's a feel good that happens with that.
It's interesting because have you read The Body Keeps the Score?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, famous book about addiction. The author talks about this idea that when we cannot escape the stress, what happens is the stress gets stored in the body, right? Like trauma is not actually the past event; it is the inability to process the stress. It seems like one of the things we're talking about is it's super hard to escape capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's this constant ubiquitous presence in our life, like this demand that we have to keep on performing, we have to keep on achieving, looking good, spend, and it feels like we don't have any outs.
I don't know if that's incorrect. Like as I said earlier, like it isn't like we can go to the moon or Mars and completely disengage with the system. I do think we can come up with a lot of people can find healthier coping mechanisms for the stress. And so it becomes either good stress, which helps you, achieve the things you want to achieve, or you can just lessen the stress so it isn't impairing your life. Part of acceptance is like we're in this thing that is happening around us, but we do have some control over how much we choose to engage with it and stress management and calling it out for what it is. Like I am stressed because of these consumptive patterns or these eating patterns and learning how to cope with that. Because the magical thinking about just escaping from capitalism, it's just that, it's magical thinking.
Well, it's interesting. I've been thinking a lot about the Sabbath. I grew up Seventh-day Adventist, and Jews observe the Sabbath. But on the Sabbath, you're not allowed to do anything, basically, right? Like you're not allowed to watch TV, get on the phone, be on the internet. You're not allowed to work. You're not actually allowed to spend money. The only things you're allowed to do on Sabbath are hang out with your friends, eat, go out to nature, worship God, and make love to your partner. In fact, Orthodox Jews, you're supposed to make love to your partner 5 times on the Sabbath.
Awesome.
To me, like I was just thinking about the Sabbath as like a day where you're completely opted out of capitalism. Like you're not allowed to buy anything or look at anything that you possibly might want to buy or work.
And all the things you've identified in that when you're identifying those things you can do on the Sabbath are all things that are legitimate, like self-care, like connecting with people, learning to be better, being bored, being out in nature, resting, having sex, engaging with your creativity. These are all like self-care things. And which is, we all could probably use some form of the Sabbath like once a week.
Well, it's interesting because Rabbi Abraham Heschel, one of the things he says is the Sabbath is the epitome of life. Like most people think, oh, I got to rest on the Sabbath so I can dive back in to, my regular work life, right? But no, he goes, no, we do everything else so we can have these 5 things, right? Like having sex with your partner, eating good food, spending time with friends and family, going out to nature, napping. That's what we should be doing all the time. So we say no to everything else so we can have the 5 best things.
Yeah, we've changed our mind thinking around it, and into that we have to earn that time off. We have to hustle our way to like being with rest as opposed to rest being something we're entitled to as people, as humans.
It reminds me of the Hannah Gatsby line where she talks about the job of stand-up comedy is like you have to create tension, and then once you build enough tension, the punchline helps relieve that tension. The whole thing is she created the tension in the first place. And I think about that with capitalism, right? Like capitalism allows you to succeed, allows you to purchase, to relieve the tension of feeling not enough. But capitalism is the reason why you don't feel like you're enough.
Yeah, it's the hamster wheel.
What does it feel like to be off the hamster wheel? Or do you feel like you're still on the hamster wheel, Lindsay?
I feel like I'm off of it. When I made the decision to step off of it back 2016 or so, it felt more like a survival mechanism. It didn't feel intentional. And now I stepped out of working in startup about a year or so ago. So I spent about 2 years working kind of in mental health startup space, starting in the pandemic and afterwards, thinking that this would give me a sense of purpose, like I was accomplishing something, like I was using my brain for what it was intended to. And the burnout was so awful. And I feel like this time I intentionally stepped off of it as opposed to it just being a survival mechanism. Because I probably could have indefinitely gone on doing that. But I stepped off and I was like, I can't do this. This feels icky to me. It's not in line with my value systems. And I had a period of unintentional unemployment last year where I got to like engage with boredom in a different way. And you're nodding. I am not a person who does well being bored. And I got to learn to engage with being bored, engage with kind of my own junk that I'm asking clients to do all the time is engage and sit with their junk. And I applied for all sorts of jobs and then just realized like, I just want to do therapy again. I want to sit and be a professional listener and hold space for people. And then at the end of the day, be done. I don't have to check Slack. I don't have stuff on weekends. I choose my days off. And that feels like a much more an intentional way of stepping off the hamster wheel.
Occurs to me is like you and I are the last generation that existed pre-internet. And so like growing up, I didn't have any other choice. Like when I was bored, I had to be bored, right? Like driving in the backseat while my parents we were on a road trip, right? Just staring out the window. And I feel like there's something lost when there is a distraction constantly available to you.
Yep. I mean, it goes back to addiction, like what we use addictions for is we don't want to sit with our own junk. And the same thing is with like toxic productivity or constantly having to be on our hand computers or constantly having to like engage with like 16 things at once is we're uncomfortable like sitting with our stuff and our thoughts and the icky things about being human. And I work with teenagers partially because I'm apparently a masochist a little bit, but I work with teenagers and couples. But my teenagers, I really worry about teenagers as a group because they really struggle with boredom because they don't like in class, they've got their phones or they've got earpods, they're listening to music. They're not really engaging, doing the work of teenagers, which is to like have emotions and react to them and mess up and try it again. Like we have these generations coming up that aren't given the space to engage with that stuff. And so I think we'll see people really struggling. And I see it in people that I work with in their 20s are really struggling to be able to just sit with the stuff without reaching for something, a substance, the phone, so on and so forth.
Yeah, a couple of times during this conversation, I've been wondering about the idea of resilience, and are younger people going to be less resilient because they aren't able to sit with their emotions?
It's hard. I think probably every older generation has said that about a younger generation because we somehow think that we have done this better. And, we were to think about how we think about our parents, how they think they did it better. I think that it is harder for them to become resilient, but I definitely have seen the kids who have moved through that have a greater sense of resilience because they've had more obstacles in terms of getting in touch with their own emotions. I do think they're often more engaged with the world around them. Like, I had to learn about mental health and climate change because I had so many teens and people in their early 20s that wanted to engage with that topic. And that takes resilience to be able to sit with a problem that is so big that nobody has the answer to it. But they're also like, they're just doing it a different way. I think just because the boomers thought they were resilient because they had to deal with a certain set of context. We were resilient because we had to deal with a certain set of context. I think the kids of today will get there. I just think they've got some different obstacles in their way with the attention economy.
Well, one of the things I worry about is because the 24-hour news cycle and Twitter is it's impossible for anyone, and we're talking about younger people right now, but all of us to escape the stress cycle, right? Like when I was a kid, the news was for half an hour each evening, right? And the news is constant now, and the news is never good, right? Because the news is always about bad. And I feel like the ubiquity, and like I can't blame kids for the ubiquity of bad news around them, but if you fall into the media cycle, you can feel bad about the world 24 hours a day.
Bad about the world and bad about yourself. Teenage brains, brains don't quit to really stop developing until we're in our mid to late 20s. And you're thinking about generations now that their brain has developed to constantly need feedback and constantly need those dopamine hits. And you can't escape the feeling of either like being watched or the devastation that nobody's watching me. And the frequency of like pretty severe anxiety disorders, just anecdotally, and the anxieties are that I see in older teens and people in their late 20s or early 20s is really alarming to me because they're just constantly seeking, like, I got to be seen. And what happens if I'm not seen? Am I not relevant? The whole likes thing is dangerous.
Yeah, and it's so connected to consumerism. So this feels like we've hit the bottom. Bring us back up. What are some of the ways, some tools that we have to help ourselves with all this?
Knowledge is power. And I think being able to slow down and intentionally engage with this stuff is key to it. And in terms of like the course, the financial freedom course, I think this is what real self-care and real like growth looks like. It's not always comfortable, right? But we have to engage with it because we can avoid it and we have it like built up on our bodies and we have it built up on our souls, or we can choose to engage with it and decide how we want to live our lives. And I think knowledge is power, like learning about things like money scripts and learning about how I want to engage with my financial future. It's hard work, but I think that's where the freedom is. And that's where the growth and the joy can be is the intentional engagement. But it requires work, which I have this particular relationship, Douglas, with the wellness industry and the self-care industry around that you can purchase that sense of ease and that sense of freedom and peace. You can purchase it. And that's not how this works. Like self-care and wellness, like it's uncomfortable things that take work, but they're also like learning about yourself is a really joyful process. Like, hey, this is what's important to me. This is how I got to be this way. I think that's amazing. And I think giving opportunities for learning, I think learning and curiosity. Curiosity is one of my fundamental values. I think if people are able to engage with stuff with curiosity, I think there's something really good at the end of that.
I love that. One of the things I say is the biggest thing that financial freedom has ever given me is I've been able to be faithful to my curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
But talk about your own financial journey since 2019. As you've gotten greater awareness and more knowledge, tell us where you are now.
I feel like I'm in a pretty good place. The goal of my financial freedom is never going to be early retirement. Still have student debt. that from getting a second degree. But I started in 2019 from a place of just like panic and scarcity. Mental health jobs right out of the gate don't pay a lot. I had racked up some debt, drained my savings, trying to like live a certain standard of living, like lawyer standard of living, while I was in graduate school. And then when I started a really low paying job, and I'm in a much better place now. Won't be able to retire early. I enjoy my job and enjoy the work, but I am aware of my debt load. I am aware of like my savings. I am aware of my investments. Everything for me is automated, which is I don't even have to think about it. Things go, I get paid. Things go places where I don't have to pay attention to them. I don't think I've opened up my investment account in 6 months because I'm just like, it's doing the work. And I think that has been the biggest change for me is did the hard emotions of budgeting, did the hard emotions of looking where my debt was, did that work for 2 or 3 years and sorted stuff out. Because it did take 3 years for me to kind of untangle things. And now I'm in a place where I am working and things are happening and I don't have panic or anxiety about it anymore.
I love that. I mean, basically, past Lindsay did the work to set present Lindsay to feel much more secure and happy.
Yeah. And it is work, which is, something we talk about in therapy all the time. Like there is a future you that doesn't have these stresses, but it does require work and sacrifice and sitting with your junk.
Well, it occurs to me that when you were a young lawyer, you probably, I'm guessing, tell me if I'm wrong, you probably both did not look at your finances and did not look at your junk.
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, the hamster wheel you jump on in that profession, especially at the level that I was able to jump into it, is I did really well in school. So I was paid more money than I could even imagine to right out of the gate, is holy shit. Like I can get a car that isn't an old farm vehicle. I can buy myself a car. I can live in a nice part of Portland. I can have, I was a big thrift shopper in college and I can actually have new clothes. And then that's what everybody around you is doing. You buy a house, then you buy a bigger house, and then you do all these things. I was fully in that space where it's like, this is the natural progression of this. And you're so engaged in that you're not spending time with the wait a minute, I don't want this. I don't want any of this, because you're just in the avalanche of this is what it means to be a lawyer.
It reminds me, Carl Jung talks about the real journey for a human is to move away from the idea that all solutions are external, getting a nicer home in Portland, having a nicer car, having a nice career. You have to go through the night sea journey, this really difficult, dark cave, right? And what emerges is understanding that all the solutions are internal, it's self-understanding. And you've gone through this journey in a really deep way.
Yeah. I think Jung is right in a certain extent. I also think that some things are internal and some of the solutions are internal, but we also have to reckon with the fact that some of what we can do once we have completed our internal journey is limited by external forces. My internal journey, I would just own a tiny house farm with thousands of huskies and not have to I could just go and get food and raise huskies and mountain bike all day long. And that would be the natural conclusion of my internal journey. I'm limited by external forces. I think that there's a way to balance both, but I think you have to come to reckon with those external forces and realize.
Well, all of us are limited by external forces, right? And that's one of the recognitions that we have to come to. All right, we're closing in on the end of this episode. A couple questions. First of all, what would be your pitch for financial freedom to someone who's never taken it?
This is what real self-care looks like. I mean, period.
Amazing.
You don't need, yeah.
You don't need to buy anything on Instagram. You just have to learn about your personal finances.
You got to engage with your junk and examine your relationship with money. It's just like your relationship with other people, your relationship with substances. It is a relationship.
So good. Where can people find you if they want therapy from you, like either about, general therapy or, you have some expertise around finances?
I currently work for a private group practice called Senua Counseling Clinic. Senua is spelled Senua. You can just Google Senua Counseling Clinic. They're based in Lake Oswego. I am fully virtual. I am only licensed in Oregon, so this is only really good for folks that are coming here from Oregon. You can reach out to their intake department. That information is on their homepage, and Senua Counseling, Senua Counseling. I think it's clinic.com, but if you just Google Senua Counseling, you'll be able to find it.
All right. Last question, which is a fun one. Take something that you know really well, either biking or therapy, and what's a good metaphor within that field for your personal finances?
Here's the good. I'm going to combine these a little bit of both. It's a sports metaphor that I use with my clients all the time. You can imagine like surfing, and if you want to think about it metaphorically, the waves at the ocean, they never stop. They can be our thoughts, they can be our emotions, they can be the fact that we have to make a living. Never stops, never stops. Most new surfers, if you ever got to short sands, will stand in the waves, point their surfboard straight at the waves, and it'll get beat back by the breaker over and over again. We stand up, we have to resist it, there's all these things that we do to go straight through the breaker. And you can think about that in terms of we avoid our relationships, our thoughts and feelings. We avoid our relationship with consumer cycles. And sometimes the only way through the waves is we have to learn how to become with a different relationship with the wave. So when in therapy, I talk about learning how to duck under the wave. Ducking under the wave to get past the breaker isn't comfortable. We have to hold our breath. We have to put our face in the water. If you're in Oregon, there's sharks. But once you get on the other side of that wave, you realize the wave has less power over you. And the next time the wave comes in, you'll be able to better equip it. But you have to do the uncomfortable thing. Go under the wave.
That's amazing.
That's what I got. That's what I got today. I got it finally honed because it's part of the shtick that I give most of my clients at the end of our first session.
Well, thank you, Lindsay. Thanks for appearing. This was a really fun episode.
Absolutely. It was really good to reconnect and remind myself that there's some re-engaging that I could be doing with some of this material and some of these concepts. The learning doesn't stop when the course stops and the course corrections have been made. Like the learning needs to keep happening because as we change in our lives, that our relationships with money change. And it might be time for me to do some re-engagement with some of this stuff as well.
Yeah, as my old business, Portland Underground Grad School, never stop learning.
Exactly.
Well, thanks, Lindsay. And thank you. Thank you, everyone, for listening. You've been listening to the School of Financial Freedom podcast. This is Douglas Soy. I'm your host, and we'll be around for another episode soon. Thank you. Thank you for tuning in to the School of Financial Freedom podcast, where we ask, what does it mean to live a meaningful inner and outer life? And how do our personal finances fit into that? We hope you enjoyed this episode and it helps you live with an increasing sense of empowerment, integrity, and agency in the world. For more information, resources, and to re-listen to this or any past episodes, visit our website at schoolofinancialfreedom.com. There you can find out when the next cohort of Financial Freedom 1, the online course is. If you've enjoyed today's show, please consider leaving us a review as it helps more people find us and join our community of people interested in the intersection of money and personal and spiritual growth. I'm Douglas Soy, founder of the School of Financial Freedom. You can also find me on Substack, where you can subscribe to my popular newsletter, Money and Meaning. I also love hearing from readers and listeners, so write me at www.douglassoy.com. I'm grateful that you listened, and I hope that this episode has given you hope and insight into taking control of your finances to live the life you want.